Comment ça va? Who said that? It is the 19th of February, Sunday morning adult class auditorium, and we are studying Between the Testaments. I need to let you know that at about 9:30, toward the end of the class, about 9:30, a bunch of kids are going to come in, and this will involve some of you who don't know who you are yet, I don't think, but it will involve some of you. And there'll be a little bit of, wondering what's going on, but you don't worry about it. Everything's fine. Some people are going to be getting up and leaving. So I'm just going to keep talking. For the folks that are still here, and especially for the folks who are online, welcome to you as well, so that we don't have a silence on the line on the feed. Okay? About 9:30. That'll last about 3 minutes, I'm told, so it won't last very long. We're going to do a quick review because it's been a couple of weeks. I always want to put this slide up. I don't guess I have to explain it anymore. There was a very good question posed the last time that makes me think that we probably need to resituate our chronological timeline, because in the beginning I gave you the timeline, and then we got into Daniel, who was all over the place, sort of, at least in the beginning years of the timeline. I want to come back and reiterate that timeline, at least as far as concerns what Daniel was saying to us. Daniel in chapter 2 and chapter 7 identifies the progression of kingdoms beginning with Babylon. In chapter 2, it's with a statue, and in chapter 7, it's with animals. You remember the lion, the bear, I always want to say the tiger. It's a leopard, and then the monster beast, representing these four kingdoms, Rome being the last of Daniel's prophecies. Then Daniel gets a little more specific in chapter 8, and he starts talking about how Persia will be defeated by Greece. This is the ram and the he-goat. The ram is Persia, the he-goat is Greece, and the he-goat then destroys the ram and takes over. That's what he's talking about in chapter 8. And then in 11, he talks about the Greeks, and gets into the kings of the south and the kings of the north. That's the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and all the back and forth between them. And then he talks about Antiochus IV, a very long passage that we didn't read at the time. We're going to read when we talk about the Seleucids, about how cruel Antiochus IV is and why the Maccabees then rose up against him. And then the Maccabees morphed into the Hasmonean dynasty, or Hasmonean, if you say it that way. And then you have the Romans again. So it all fits together in that way. So I hope that clears things up a little bit as we're reviewing. Now, from there we went back to the Persians, the Medo-Persians. And we started talking about them last week. One thing I want to bring out that's important to understand is that when Israel was released to go back to Jerusalem, Israel was not freed from Persian domination. They could go back to their homeland, but they still were under the domination of the Persian Empire, which was a very heavy domination sometimes. In Nehemiah 9, I hope you have your Bibles, Nehemiah 9, Ezra is praying just before they rededicate the new wall. And he says this in verses 36 and 37, behold, he's praying to the Lord and saying, behold, we are slaves this day in the land that you gave to our fathers to enjoy its fruit and its good gifts. Behold, we are slaves. And its rich yield goes to the kings whom you have set over us because of our sins. And he has enumerated all those sins already in this prayer, how Israel disobeyed God. They rule over our bodies and over our livestock as they please, and we are in great distress. So Israel freed from, returned to its land, was not freed from its slavery to the Persian domination. We looked at these kings, Cyrus II, who then released Israel to go back to Israel. Then there was this whole succession of kings. Then there were the last 4 or 5 that were involved in this period between the Testaments. I told you last week, or I told you sometime anyway, that Xerxes the Great was assassinated. I discovered this week, when I was looking at that again, that many Jewish scholars think that Esther was probably also assassinated. as that was the general practice in those days. You get rid of a king, you get rid of his family. There's no proof of that. It's just what they think probably happened, given the particular way things were done in the Persian courts at the time. Okay, we're talking about the last 4 or 5 kings here. We talked last time about Bagoas, who was the serial murderer of Artaxerxes II, the third, and the fourth, and then who got poisoned himself by Darius III. And we're going to come up on Bagoas or Bagoses again today, and I'll talk about that later. We talked about the satrapy that was put over, the satraps that were put over Judea, who were generally good to them, generally, but not always, and were very strictly controlled by the king of Persia. We talked about the Samaritans at Gerizim, who built their, I always want to say their castle, it's a temple. And if you look at these pictures, you see there's a pretty complicated structure there. It's still there. These are modern pictures, relatively recent anyway. It's still there, and there are still Samaritans in Judea today. Samaritans separated themselves from the Jews because they were kind of a mixed race, and the Jews didn't like them, and they didn't like the Jews. So they left and went up to the mountain of blessing, Mount Gerizim, and they built this temple, which was eventually destroyed. We'll talk about that. Then we talked about the synagogues that began before the Persian period. They began in the Babylonian period, but were developed in the Persian period, and then they caught on, and all the way to today, Jews still go to their synagogues thousands of years later. When we were just getting ready, synagogues are houses of prayer, houses of study, and kind of place to get together with people of like faith. We're getting ready to talk about a murder in the temple when we stopped last time. How many of you ever heard about the murder that occurred in the temple in Jerusalem? This is the rebuilt temple, a murder in the temple. The name of the guy who was murdered, actually murder is not really I don't think murder is the best word. He was killed in an argument. It wasn't as if it was planned. He was killed in an argument. The high priest's name was John or Johanan. We're going to read Josephus' account of this. And the name of the guy who was killed was his brother. His name was Jesus. Now, I don't think there's any prophetic value in that. Jesus was a common name at the time. Jesus is a common name in some cultures even today. Jesus. But this Jesus tried to take over the high priesthood, and he got himself killed in the process because of an argument. Okay, we talk about that. Let's look at what Josephus had to say about this. This is in book 11 of Josephus. Now, we're going to be some reading today. I hope that's big enough for you. Not big enough for me, so I'm going to read it off my paper here. Actually, I can sort of read that. When Eliashib, the high priest, was dead, his son Judas, or Jehoiada sometimes called, succeeded in the high priesthood. Excuse me. And when he was dead, his son John, or Johannes, took that dignity, on whose account it was also Bagoses, that's another name for Bagoas. Bagoses, the general of another Artaxerxes army, polluted the temple and imposed tributes on the Jews, that out of the public stock, before they offered the daily sacrifices, they should pay for every lamb 50 shekels. That's a high tax. Now, Jesus was a brother of John and was a friend of Bagoses, who was this high-up Persian guy, who had promised to procure him the high priesthood. Oh, there's more. In confidence of whose support, Jesus quarreled with John in the temple, and so provoked his brother, John, that in his anger, John, his brother, slew him, Jesus. Now, it was a horrible thing for John when he was high priest to perpetrate so great a crime, and so much the more horrible that there never was so cruel and impious a thing done, neither by the Greeks nor barbarians. However, God did not neglect its punishment. This is Josephus' assessment of the situation. But the people were on that very account enslaved, and the temple was polluted by the Persians. Accordingly, Bagoses punished the Jews 7 years for the murder of Jesus. Now, excuse me a second. This situation, most historians believe, is in a context of argument about Jewish identity. It began early on, as you see, and this will continue all the way up to the Romans. There were some Jews, most Jews, who wanted to retain their Jewish identity, following the law of Moses, being separate, being the people of God. There were a few Jews who wanted to adapt to the ambient culture. They wanted to let the culture in. They wanted to be like those people that were around them. And they wanted to turn loose of their original faith. Now, when I was looking at this is my own reaction. I said to myself, people haven't changed, have they? Even in the church, people haven't changed. We have people in the church. This works in Europe too, the same. Who want to retain the original identity of the church. They want to be the church of the New Testament. They don't want anything to come in that would change the doctrines of the New Testament. They don't want anything to come in from the culture that would change the practices of the first century church. And then we have those who, well, what's the problem? Let's just let loose of a few things, blend in, and we'll attract more people in the church. That's an argument that we hear today, even today, and it was going on then in the Jewish people, and I guess it's something that's a natural human tendency. Some who want to stay strictly to the guidelines, and others who would prefer to say, okay, let's just loosen them up a bit and be a little bit more popular. Okay, let's talk about Eliashib here. Well, here's a guy who is explaining the situation, sort of. The high priestly office became the object of all Jewish ambition, and it aroused the darkest passion. Thus John, the son of Judas, son of Eliashib, through the lust of power. I don't think it was John's lust of power, if you ask me, from the description. It was more like Jesus' lust of power, his brother, who was a favorite of Bagoses, a general of Artaxerxes in command of the district. Okay, so there is an Eliashib in the Bible in the time of Nehemiah. His name is Eliashib with an H. And it's pretty easy to think that this might be the same one. But it might not be. But anyway, there is an Eliashib at the time of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is at the end, right at the beginning of the 400-year period, just before, actually, a little bit before. He was a contemporary, of course, of Ezra. And he was in a kind of a dispute with a guy named Tobiah, who was an Ammonite, who tried to delay the rebuilding of the walls. If you read the story, it's in Nehemiah 13. Eliashib was involved in this tension, and he threw Tobiah out, who he had a room in the temple, in the rebuilt temple. Tobiah had a room that Eliashib had made up for him for some crazy reason. Nehemiah threw the guy out. And it makes you think, but it's not in the text, it makes you think that Nehemiah and this guy Eliashib probably didn't get along really well. Because everything Eliashib did, Nehemiah canceled it. He threw out the people that Eliashib was welcoming into the temple. Okay, so there is one remark that I'd like to read to you from Adam Clark about this guy Eliashib. He says, perhaps this was a different person from Eliashib the high priest, but there's no indubitable evidence that he was not the same. If he was high priest, if this is the Eliashib of the Bible, he says, he was very unfaithful to the high charge which he had received and a reproach to the priesthood. That's Adam Clark. All right, so there's that incident. So someone was actually murdered or killed in the temple of Jerusalem right in the beginning of this 400-year period. Now let's talk about elephantine. That's a weird-looking word. I looked it up, and that's the way they say to pronounce it, elephantine. How many of you have heard of elephantine? Elephantine was an island in the Nile. Still is, I guess. That island is still there, as far as I know. Well, I'll tell you something about that in a minute. But you remember that in the introduction, it said that when Jews were released from Babylon, they went everywhere. They went all over the place. Not necessarily just to Judea. Well, some of them went to Egypt. Some of them went pretty far down into Egypt, way down close to to the Aswan area. Okay, so here's our brother Ferguson, Everett Ferguson, who says in his book, The World of the New Testament, he's quoting Strabo. Strabo, the geographer, wrote in the 1st century BC that it was not easy to find one place in the world where there were no Jews. There were large settlements in Alexandria, in Antioch of Syria, as well as in Rome. There were a few farmers, but their occupations would mostly take them to the cities. There were government officials, tradesmen such as tent makers, and even actors. And there was something else I'll tell you in a minute. The Jews remained a distinctive people even after they had lived abroad for generations. They consciously maintained the dividing line that kept them apart from pagans. I would qualify that by saying the most part of the Jews did. Not all. But most of them did want to keep themselves apart from the pagans. Some of them were for blending in, as I was saying. So, some of those Jews went to a place called Elephantine in Egypt. It's an island in the Nile. Now, the folks online are not going to be able to see this pointer, I guess. But you see it right about here at Aswan. Now, the other day, I was thinking, Aswan, wasn't there a dam built there in the 70s? I looked it up. And there was a dam built right there in the 70s. And I'm thinking, did that just flood over that island? I don't know. I could not find any reference to the island of Elephantine in the construction of the dam. Anybody find something like that? Let me know. I think that would be interesting. But anyway, during this period, just before and just after the 400-year mark that we're looking at, there was a community of 600 to 700 Jews living on this island in Egypt. Some may have come to Egypt directly from exile in Babylon. Some, perhaps, while the temple in Jerusalem was being attacked, while the city of Jerusalem was being attacked, maybe they already came down at that time. At any rate, they settled on this island, situated then near the present-day Aswan. Everything we know about this group comes from a discovery by an American Egyptologist whose name was Charles Edwin Wilbur in 1893. He found in the area there a bunch of papyri. By the way, folks, when I heard Michael say papyri in his class, I thought, is that right? It sounds weird. I've always said papyri. So I looked it up. Michael's absolutely right. Papyri. Like we say alumnus, alumni. Walrus, walrus. You get it? No, we don't say walrus. We say walruses. I was hoping to get a laugh on that, but I didn't. So anyway, the English language is weird. But papyri, papyrus, papyri. You can also say, and I'm really glad, papyruses. You can say that too. So if I say papyruses, it's okay. So anyway, he found these papyri, large collection of them, known as the Elephantine papyri, that date back to 500 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. 500 years older than the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they talk about marriage, about these Jews that are living there, marriage, labor conditions, real estate, religion, and burial among these Jews. So this is a pretty good historical find. So what happened was, these Jews in Egypt, at Aswan, at Elephantine, they knew that the temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed. They decided they were going to build their own, which they did then. They burned incense, they performed animal sacrifice, they worshiped the God of Abraham. All of this is in these papyri. And they observed the Sabbath and the Feast of Passover and so forth. They lived in peace with their Egyptian neighbors for a while, and they kept the Jewish laws. Some of them, in fact, a large number of them, from other sources that I've looked at, say that they belonged to a military unit which served to guard Egypt's southern border, because they were pretty far down in Egypt. They were guarding the southern border. A lot of them were soldiers. And by the way, when we get into Alexander the Great and all these other guys that are going to follow him, a lot of the Jews then got into those guys' armies and fought for them and with them. That's one of the things that a lot of the Jews did. So these Jews in Elephantine didn't bother them to build a temple, even though they knew that the law declared that the temple could only be in one place, and that would be Jerusalem. Now, here's who they worshiped. They worshiped a god whose name they called Yahweh, or Yahoo, which is obviously a corrupted name of Yahweh. And because they lived among Egyptians, and because they lived around Egyptians, they intermarried with them, and they also took on some of the Egyptian gods. They became polytheistic. Maybe I shouldn't say became, because wasn't that the problem already in Jerusalem? Isn't that why God sent them off into captivity? Because they were polytheistic. Because they weren't worshiping just God, they were worshiping God and other gods, idols. And that's why they went off into... So these Jews probably already were polytheistic. But they adopted the Egyptian gods. Here are some of the names that I found of some of the Egyptian gods that were probably worshipped by these Jews. There's another thing. If you see that in a thrift store, grab that. Anukis, or state, or statit, or satit, or satis. It's different, pronounced differently. And then there are other gods that I found that the Jews probably worshipped: Isham Bethel, Aneth Bethel, Aneth Yahu, Herem Bethel, and so forth. So monotheism was out. Well, it never came back, in other words, for these Jews. Here's the site of their destroyed temple. And what happened was that in 410 BC, the priests of another temple that was not far away, they were the priests of Khnum, Temple of Khnum. They didn't like the fact that these Jews were sacrificing animals, some of which were sacred to these Egyptian priests. So they attacked the temple, they took out all the gold and silver, and they destroyed the temple. Pretty much totally. What year did I say that was? About 410. So this place was never really reconstructed. But 3 years after the destruction, the Elephantine Jews applied to the Persian governor in this letter that was found in the papyri for permission to rebuild the temple. Here's this is a guy named Breasted, who says this: "This remarkable letter was discovered in 1907 with many other similar papers lying in the ruins of the town of Elephantine in Upper Egypt. They had built a temple to Yahweh in the banks of the Nile. This letter tells how the jealous Egyptian priests formed a mob, burned the Hebrew temple, plundered it of its gold and silver vessels. Thereupon the whole Hebrew community sat down in mourning, and for 3 years they tried in vain to secure permission to rebuild." This would be from the Persians. Then in 407 BC, their leaders wrote this letter to Bagoas, the Persian governor of Palestine. Maybe that's the same guy. Maybe it is. It could very well be. It would be an older... Well, no, this was right before all the poisoning, as I recall. But anyway, or during. Begging him to use his influence with the Persian governor of Egypt. They refer by name to persons in Palestine who are also mentioned in the Old Testament. The letter is written with pen and ink on papyrus, in the Aramaic language, which was now rapidly replacing or displacing the Hebrew. So, we notice the name of Bagoas. Sometimes he's called Bagoses, but we don't know if it's the same guy. It could be. I think it probably is, but there's no way to say for sure. And different sources say that the temple was rebuilt, never rebuilt. Well, actually, it was rebuilt, but it was eventually abandoned. All right, that's a good transition. We're leaving the Persian period, and we're going to go into the Greek period. Still showing this same slide in the beginning, of course. We're going to talk about Alexander the Great mostly, but not right away, who considered himself the son of a god, not a real human, not a pure human being, but the son of a real god that he worshipped. And he called himself, or had himself called, the King of Kings, and a bunch of other things. We're going to talk about how his appearing affected the world and how it affected the Jews during this period of 400 years between the Testaments. I mentioned, while we were talking about Artaxerxes and Bagoas, the poisoner, that he had encouraged the city-states to fight among themselves. He funded one and the other So they would fight. So they would fight because the Greeks were always fighting each other anyway. It was hard for them to get together. They finally did here, but it was hard for them to get together because all the city-states were ferociously independent. So it wasn't easy to get an army up that included more than one city-state. Maybe two you could get, but that was about it. Okay, so they finally got together, eventually defeating the Persian Empire. That happened when the Persians, this is the Persian Empire map. That happened when they moved east and started to try to get Greece in their kingdom. And the Greeks then began to revolt, city-states in the beginning. The Greek Empire is thought to have begun as early as the time of the biblical judges in the 12th century BC. That we don't really think about a lot. And as I said, they were fiercely independent. Now, the Persian Wars between Greece and Persia lasted between 500 to 331, which is well inside our 400-year period. We have a couple of famous battles. I'm not going to spend much time on these because they're way before our 400-year period. A couple of famous battles that solidified the Greek power. Marathon in 490 BC. We've heard the story, have we not, about the guy who ran all the way from Marathon to Athens to report that the victory had been won. Then when he got there, what happened? He died. He ran and he died. The distance was 28.85 miles. In 1896, when it was first run, the first race in Athens, 25.85 miles. In 1908, the marathon was run in Rome, and not in Rome, in London. And they wanted it to stop in front of the Royal Box, so they shortened it to 26, or they made it 26, I guess. They lengthened it a little bit. And then in the first, the Paris Olympics in 1924, I don't know how they decided on 26.219. I mean, that sounds crazy, but that's what it is today. So there was a battle of Marathon in which the Greeks defeated the Persians. Then there was a minor battle where the Persians won. The Battle of Thermopylae, 490. You've probably heard this, seen this film about this battle, where King Leonidas took 300 of his best soldiers. He held the pass for a while, but they were eventually overcome. This was a Persian victory over the Greeks. Then there's the Battle of Salamis, where Athens, the Greeks were building ships all the time. And in this battle, Salamis, it was a naval battle with the Persians. The Persians lost 200 ships and 12,000 men, whereas the Greeks lost just 40 ships. So the Greeks were rising in power. They were rising in power during this time, and they were asserting themselves more and more, but essentially as city-states. This was the Athenians alone, not the whole country of Greece, that defeated the Persians in this battle. After this battle, where Xerxes was involved, he was the king, Esther's husband. This discouraged him. He left everything. He went back to his home state, wherever that was. I think it was in Susa, and he quit. And he left the battles against Greek to his general Mardonius, who was killed pretty soon after that. Then after that, Athens and Sparta fought between themselves for power over Greece for the next, I don't know, I wrote it down here somewhere, from 431 to 404, essentially about 30 years. So they could not get together. They were all fighting independently, and they needed someone. They needed someone to get them together. And who was that someone going to be? That someone was going to be Philip of Macedon, who was not a Greek originally. He was a Macedonian from the north of Greece. And he was the one who got the Greeks together. He understood that the Greeks needed to be united, and he wanted to create this united Greece. Now, Macedon, to the north of Greece, you see, was where he grew up. When he was a young man, that area was attacked by the city of Thebes. You see Thebes down here? Thebes? Thebes is here. That city-state attacked this whole area here. And there were battles going on, and Philip of Macedon was taken hostage. He remained in Thebes for 3 years, and there he ran into, well, I don't know if he ran into, he was associated, he knew about a general whose name is Epaminondas, who was a great Theban general who had developed a whole bunch of military tactics for making war. So Philip was learning some stuff while he was in being a hostage. Then when he was released, he went back to Macedon. His brother Perdiccas was ruling, but when his brother died, then Philip of Macedon took over, and he transformed Macedonia into a powerful military state with the idea of taking over Greece and making it a united country. There's a big battle that was fought in 338 rather, against Athens. He offered to take over, he offered to unite Greece under his rule. They resisted, especially the Athenians. And in this battle of CHAERONEA, he defeated the Athenians and also the Thebes who were fighting with him there. So the importance of this battle is that in this battle there was a young man who was the leader of the right flank of Philip of Macedon's army. This young man's name was Alexander. It was his son. And he was 15 years old. And he was leading a whole right flank of a very large army fighting in CHAERONEA. And he sort of proved himself there in that time. I think, and apparently he participated in more than one battle. So Philip of Macedon firmly established his position as head of a league of all the Greek states, with the exception of Sparta. Sparta held out. The next logical step then was the final defeat of the Persian Empire. He was preparing to go into the Persian Empire and to defeat it. He had a good army, he had a strong army, and he had decided, okay, this is the next step. But that wasn't going to happen because then he was assassinated. So many of these people that we look at are assassinated. Alexander was present when his father, Philip, was assassinated. There's a sordid story behind this of homosexuality and jealousy among the guards, the bodyguards. And there's even some credence to the theory that Philip's wife, Olympias, whom we're going to look at today, maybe if we have time, she might have been involved. Alexander always thought his whole adult life that his mother was somehow involved in the assassination of his father. So here we go. Alexander the Great takes over. He's 20 years old. 20 years old. He has under his control, well, in his hands, it wasn't under his control right away because he had to assert himself. He had to attack Thebes and burn it all up and then sell the people as slaves to show that he was in control. That's what he did. But he was 20 years old and he was in charge of this huge project because Greece was a strong nation, growing nation, but Persia was the main power. Okay, so the Greeks were going to try to take over this power. So what was he going to do? I spent a lot of time reading about Alexander, and I found his life extremely interesting. And then I began thinking, what was I doing when I was 20? What were you doing when you were 20? What if somebody handed you a major power and said, okay, do what you want to do with this. And here's this big power that's been dominating us for a couple of centuries, so you have to take it over. You have to beat it. You're 20 years old. Well, he did his best to do that. He was a very interesting young man. He is the great he-goat of Daniel 8, who's going to take down the ram of Daniel 8. So at 35, okay, we got time for this. Oh, that's kind of small for you, I suppose. This is the guy whose name is Quintus Curtius Rufus, a Roman historian, who wrote this about Alexander. It is said by some that he was handsome, with curly hair, and by others that he was probably ordinary and of short stature. I find that kind of strange, that some would think he was really handsome, and others would think he's ordinary. That sort of depends on, in the eyes of the beholder or something like that. From the stuff that I've been reading, he was apparently a good-looking young man. Some say he had heterochromia, one eye brown, the other blue. He was certainly very physically fit, a master of sword fighting and of all combat skills, who worked out every day and kept fit with heavy physical military style exercise. He had some great natural gifts, a noble disposition surpassing that of all other monarchs, resolution in the face of danger. I would say, reading his story, recklessness in the face of danger. He took terrible chances. Speed in undertaking and completing projects. Integrity in dealing with those who surrendered, and mercy toward prisoners. restraint even in those pleasures which are generally acceptable, to whom I'm wondering, and widely indulged. But all these were marred by his inexcusable fondness for, one word, what would you think? He had an inexcusable fondness for, it wasn't the word I thought it would be. Any ideas? Are you thinking women? I hear yes. I hear war. Anything else? Women, war? Himself. Okay. He wasn't very fond of himself. But the word this historian said was drink. Drink. He says, at the very time his enemy and rival for imperial power was preparing to resume hostilities, and when the conquered nations only recently subdued still had scant respect for his authority, he was attending daytime drinking parties at which women were present, courtesans who had been leading disreputable lives with the soldiers. Now, I read a lot of stories about his drinking, and he apparently was one of those who, what's the expression? He knew how to hold his drink. Is that the way you say it? He could drink a lot before it affected him, apparently. I've known one person like that. I knew one guy, I saw him on the night before he was married. He drank himself to a stupor, couldn't stand up, hands and knees on the floor. And then the next day, there he was, standing up, tall and proud, marrying his bride. Crazy. I guess there are people like that. This guy was not like that. He could drink a whole lot. Well, I guess this guy was like that, that's what I'm saying. He was like that. He could drink himself silly, but it took him a while. It took him a long time. He drank a lot. Now, Alexander was a pagan through and through. He not only believed in the Greek gods, he worshiped them fervently, had a bunch of them, and his pagan faith began his mother's knee. Her name was Olympias. She was the wife of Philip of Macedon. Now, I want you to look at this sculpture, I guess you'd call this, in stone. I want you to see if you can identify the expression on this woman's face. I'm going to tell you a little bit about her here that will justify that expression. I think that expression, the French would call this espiègle. That means mischievous. Do you see any mischievousness in this face? Like she wouldn't mind doing some strange things? This lady was a fan of orgiastic ceremonies. She was the wife of the king, but she enjoyed orgiastic ceremonies, orgies. She didn't get along with her husband for that reason. He didn't like these things. And so they didn't spend a lot of time together. They were often apart from each other. But she was one of those persons that enjoyed that sort of thing. And she convinced her son Alexander that he was the descendant and the heir, not of Philip, but of Zeus Ammon, an Egyptian prophetic oracle god. And there's a story behind that too. Let's see, we have 5 minutes. Olympias and Philip of Macedon, as I said, didn't get along. And there's a legend that there was this Egyptian pharaoh named Nectanebo who was defeated by some rebels and fled with a bunch of gold to Macedonia, where Olympias was. He became so famous for his magic powers that Olympias took advantage of the absence of her husband Philip to spend some time with him, Get my point? This guy convinced her that she should be intimately united to a god and that he was the incarnation of this god Zeus Ammon. So you know where that went. And it is altogether possible, I suppose, that Alexander the Great was the son of this guy and not of Philip of Macedon. So after the flight of Nectanebo from Egypt, well, I'm supposed to show you this picture. There's Nectanebo. After he fled from Egypt with gold, there was an oracle that declared this: one day this fugitive will return to Egypt as a king, not as an old man, but as a triumphant young man. And he will conquer our enemies, the Persians. That's a legend. But when Alexander came to Egypt, and we're going to see that next week, I guess, when he came to Egypt, this legend was what helped him to convince the people that he was their legitimate ruler. Now I'm going to jump ahead here real quickly. We've got a few minutes. When he went to Egypt, there's a shrine of Zeus Hammon way out at Karnak. Way out in the desert, Karnak. And Alexander decided he was going to go out there. It took him several days. He lost several of his men on the way. It was a terrible journey. He wanted to go out there and consult this oracle. And he had 3 questions for the oracle. By the way, when our older folks, when you think about Karnak, here's what I think about. Yeah? Karnak the Magnificent. Anyway, he went out there to consult the oracle. And he had 3 questions for him. He said, 1, am I the son of a god? And the oracle said yes. He asked a second question. Has the death of my father been avenged? Yes. Third, was my mother involved? And the priest refused to answer. The oracle refused to answer that question. So throughout his adult life, Alexander wondered if his mother hadn't been involved in the assassination of his father. And he believed also that since she had brought him up this way, he was a sort of a god, a demigod. Now, this was the guy who was the ruler of the Jews at this time. Your ruler thinks he's a god or a demigod. What do you do to a god? You worship him. That's what he expected. That's what the people were supposed to do, was worship him. Now, he wasn't quite as ruthless as some others who took themselves for gods and required worship, but he did think of himself as a god who deserved worship. Okay. Can you put on the screen for me the program that says Vulgate? We have 2 minutes, and I've got a very short thing to show you as we finish. Another subject entirely, Vulgate. Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit. I never learned to do that list, to automatically, to memorize it. But many of you probably could say all those 9 things that are the fruit of the Spirit. I was going to get them up on the screen for you, but there we go. Fruit of the Spirit. Okay, so the oldest Greek manuscripts give these examples of fruit of the Spirit. The Vulgate, translated by Jerome in the 4th century, adds 3: modesty, continency, chastity. I never knew that. Found this in a book that I have. So I thought to myself, okay, where'd you get those, and do they still exist in the Catholic Bibles today? Well, I don't know where you got them, but they're still in the Catholic Bibles today. Here's the Catholic Bible today. It still says modesty, abstinence, chastity. And I don't know where they got that. Those are good things, obviously, but the oldest Greek manuscripts don't have those 3 items. Interesting thing that has been added to the original Greek. Okay, and that is where we're going to stop. Marshall, do I have a microphone in the back?
That's okay. An important tidbit that you need to know.
Right.
The world owes that runner a great debt of thanks because that's why we have running shoes.
Okay, for those who didn't hear that, the world owes that marathon runner a great debt because that's why we have running shoes. Nike. Okay. Thank you very much. See you next time.